reality is that said military commanders are still engaged in massive corruption, massive diversion of resources that should be going to, feed, clothe, and equip their troops. And when people, raise objections to this within the military, what happens normally is they're sent on what is in effect a suicide mission.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Jabot. And this time we are talking to a man with more than 3 decades experience in the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. Nigel Inkster was Assistant Chief and Director of Operations and Intelligence when he retired in 2006. He's worked in China and has written extensively about it and is the Senior Advisor for China and Cybersecurity at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Welcome back to Frontline, Nigel. Good to see you again.
Thank you. It's very nice to be back.
So the 12 out of 10 meeting, as Trump scored it with President Xi, is over. From what we know so far, how did it rate on progress towards ending the war in Ukraine?
The short answer is we don't know. Donald Trump said that Ukraine was the subject of extensive discussion. It was a 90-minute encounter, I believe. And we have no idea really what, if anything, of material significance transpired. I mean, both sides agreed that they wanted to see the war end, but in terms of practicalities, it's not clear that anything was discussed. I don't know whether Xi Jinping raised with Donald Trump the issue of the recent oil sanctions on Russian oil companies, but I frankly doubt it because in the overall scheme of things, those don't have that much effect on China. Yes, obviously, China's main state oil corporations have had to cease purchases of Russian oil, but a lot of the oil that's purchased by China is acquired by smaller and sometimes rather informal companies. There is a term of art in Chinese, I forget it off the top of my head, who aren't dependent upon the international banking system access to the US dollar. So I'm not sure that in itself is going to make a lot of difference. Perhaps the semiotics of it, the signaling effect that Trump is now willing to impose for the first time significant pressure on Putin will have registered with China, but whether that changes China's assessment of the situation in Ukraine, I don't know. I'd rather doubt.
I don't know how much you have to read into what President Trump said after their meeting on Ukraine, because he said that they agreed the sides were locked in and that sometimes you have to let them fight. Do you think that might indicate that President Xi has used persuasive influence over Donald Trump to bring him round to not intervening at this point?
I don't know. I'm not sure because Donald Trump himself has been very inconsistent in his attitude towards this conflict. Initially imposing very significant pressure on Ukraine to settle on what are in effect Vladimir Putin's terms, and until recently not apparently wishing to impose any particular costs on Russia. But latterly changing. So it's very difficult to gauge where the United States is ultimately going to come down in this conflict. But I mean, there is in a sense a kind of logic. Sometimes the harsh realities of life are that it might be better to let a war run through to an eventual conclusion, because then at least you do get some sense of certainty, despite the very significant costs that implies. Intervention often has the paradoxical consequence of actually extending the conflict and the damage that results.
And if the war is allowed to continue as it seems to be doing so for the foreseeable future, I just wanted to see how you see the situation as it stands right now, because the diplomatic editor of the Times, Roger Boyd, he wrote this article this week in which he says this winter approaching might be President Zelensky's last stand. And he points to money to keep Ukraine armed, healthy and warm drying up, and Western will to support the war evaporating. Do you agree with that standpoint?
I think it's rather an extreme depiction of the situation, but it's not entirely wrong. The fact is, and it certainly factors into Vladimir Putin's calculations, that despite the lack of significant progress on the battlefield, and of course Putin is being lied to by his military commanders about the extent of this process all the time. Progress, sorry. The fact is that he calculates that he can wait out the West. He calculates that Western fatigue is going to set in, that we don't have the collective will or stamina to last the course, and that Ukraine is running out of options in a sense, and in particular running out of manpower. As well as weaponry. I don't think it's necessarily that bad, because I do think that, notwithstanding an absence of very clear and cohesive European determination to do whatever it takes to keep Ukraine from failing, the fact is that there are significant centres within Europe that do have this commitment. I'm thinking Poland, the Nordic states, the Baltic states, actually the UK to some degree. And I think also, notwithstanding the criticism that it often incurs, Germany too is more ready to carry on support, at least financial, which they can readily do. So I don't think it's necessarily as gloomy as Roger Boy's article suggests, but it is clear that for Ukraine, this coming winter is going to be a very testing time, and for Vladimir Zelensky as well.
And to add to that, though, Ukraine is also successfully ramping up its own defence industrial base.
Well, it is, yes, and we're seeing this, remarkable evolution in the character of conflict, to use Clausewitz's term, where there is a sort of constant, ongoing action-reaction dynamic to develop ever more effective penetrative capabilities, and at the same time to develop ever more agile, flexible, and reliable defensive capabilities. And this is, I think, just something that's going to carry on. But certainly, Ukraine's very ingenious and flexible adaptation of tech development of UAV technologies has, I think, had a very significant effect on perceptions of warfare around the world. Everybody is now looking at this and at Ukraine as a kind of test bed for the development of military capabilities that don't involve 10-year programs that always come in, a day late and a dollar short, in exchange for things that are, much more quickly and readily deliverable in response to actual conditions on the battlefield. That's not to say that the big programs are now redundant and can be quietly buried, but this does represent a significant change, and Ukraine is very much now in the forefront of shaping this.
You mentioned earlier that President Putin is being lied to about the kind of failures or progress that his military is making on the battlefield. Do you think that might be to the detriment of what he expects of his military, and actually might actually thwart what they can actually do in future, and cause further losses that will be, in the end, sort of stall the progress?
I don't know. I don't know to what extent Vladimir Putin has a realistic assessment of what is actually going on the battlefield and what his military commanders are doing. The reality is that said military commanders are still engaged in massive corruption, massive diversion of resources that should be going to, feed, clothe, and equip their troops. And when people, raise objections to this within the military, what happens normally is they're sent on what is in effect a suicide mission. Um, to what extent Vladimir Putin is aware of and has, so to speak, priced in all of this, I just don't know. I'm not sure anybody does. But the fact is, of course, that Putin calculates that no matter what, Russia still has the mass, the resources to prevail. He's still able to get more troops to to the battlefront. He's bringing more people in. The kind of bonus joining payments for soldiers are life changing in the Russian context, and for their families in the event that the breadwinner is killed in combat. Again, the compensation is life changing, to the point where I've actually seen on Russian social media women, particularly in Russia's provinces, going online and saying, how can I get my husband to join the special military operation? Well, you can imagine if some lady living in a not particularly prepossessing part of central Russia, married to a violent alcoholic husband. The prospect of exchanging this for a life-changing payment is not unattractive.
It's quite a thought. NBC reports to have been briefed by US intelligence that President Putin is more determined than ever to pursue the war in Ukraine. Do you think that is a correct assessment? And do you think that's getting through to the White House and how they're calculating their political strategy?
Well, I think it is a correct assessment, absolutely. As I said, Putin thinks that he can outlast everybody, and that no matter what actually goes wrong or right on the battlefront, Russia's numbers and size will eventually prevail. He may have had to trim his initial strategic objective of basically taking over, neutralizing, or perhaps better, neutering Ukraine, and settle for the four regions that are currently under contestation. But he can present that as a significant victory if that's what is needed. Is this getting through to the White House? I don't know. But I think there are worrying signs that the Trump White House is not particularly interested in hearing what a former boss of mine used to call inconvenient information. So I don't know whether those messages are actually getting through or not. It's one thing to produce the intelligence; it's another thing altogether to get policymakers, to look at it and accept it for what it is.
Are you speaking from experience?
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate?
No.
I didn't think so. How great a threat do you think Putin's Russia poses beyond Ukraine's borders to countries like Britain? Some analysts argue it's already at war with us. And as the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk put it, we need to stop living with the illusion that it would be spared.
Yes, I read Donald Tusk's piece in the Times last weekend, and I found it very compelling. The fact is, that where we are with in Europe in relation to Russia is what one academic has termed a state of unpeace. We're not formally at war with Russia, but we're not at peace with it either. And we have been on the receiving end of a lot of harmful activities, whether in the form of sabotage operations, cyber attacks, cognitive operations directed against different Western audiences and designed to, so to speak, prise open existing cracks in the social and political fabric of our countries. All this is happening all the time, and I think looks set to intensify, irrespective of what happens in relation to Ukraine. So this I think is going to be the new normal, the new reality. I'm not sure that Russia has aspirations to occupy militarily large swathes of Europe. I think it's more about keeping European states off balance and deprived of political agency
In order to achieve what?
in order to, basically, in order to bolster Russia's own domestic security, and basically, Vladimir Putin's calculus, a Russian calculus, which has, been around throughout history, is that for Russia to be stable and secure, everywhere else has to be unstable and insecure.
Before the meeting with President Xi, Trump posted his intention to part with more than 30 years of US policy and start testing nuclear weapons, citing concerns over parity with Russia and China. Are we, in your assessment, in the midst of a new Cold War style nuclear arms race?
I don't know about a nuclear arms race as such, but certainly, we're confronting a state of greater strategic instability than we have known for some time. We've seen Russia effectively breaking what we come to call the nuclear taboo, the idea that nuclear weapons can never be used, by threatening to do so. We see China now moving to acquire something more akin to parity with the United States and Russia in terms of its nuclear capability, and questions about China's the viability of China's long-standing posture of no first use. All these things are changing at a time when the amount of effective arms control legislation we have got is minimal and dangerously close to becoming non-existent. So yes, this is very worrying. I mean, there is a paradox when it comes to nuclear weapons. That in a sense, you can argue that having these weapons potentially eliminates the possibility of a catastrophic conflict, but at the same time, the existence of these weapons creates circumstances in which there is a lot of space to engage in kinetic activity at a level below what you hope will trigger the nuclear threshold. And we're also seeing a number of other countries who are not currently nuclear powers starting to wonder whether they need to get in on the act in order to enhance as a kind of last ditch option for their own security.
And earlier this week, when we saw President Putin there in military fatigues being briefed by his top general, reporting back on this test of a nuclear-powered cruise missile that can fly at more than 8,500 miles over 15 hours. I wonder what you thought of that, and how dangerous you think it is to be using these kind of tests for political purposes.
Yeah, well, I mean, Russia has a bit of a track record of producing these new prototypes, but it's far from clear, at what point they're going to be capable of mass production. So I think we need to, sort of take some of this with a pinch of salt, because there is a very significant messaging and propaganda element involved. But clearly, it's undesirable that any state should feel incentivized, to develop nuclear weapons that are even more penetrative and capable of doing damage than those we already have. So it is inherently undesirable at a time when we should be looking at ways in which we can reduce overall nuclear holdings. We're going in the opposite direction.
But how concerning do you think it is that there seems to be a growing use of these tests for political purposes? And where do you think that could take us, beyond that to something much more dangerous?
It's very difficult to know, but it's obviously not a good trend, and not something that we will want to encourage. I mean, if you look back at the Cold War, I think there is a temptation to think, oh well, we kind of, absent the Cuban Missile Crisis, we kind of, managed to negotiate that, and it came out all right. The fact that, the truth is, we didn't really, because there were a lot of near misses, most of which, are not in the public domain.
And we don't yet know exactly what Donald Trump means when he says the US is going to resume nuclear testing.
No, indeed. I mean, there is some, sense in this, insofar as the US has not been testing for 30 years. It's done simulation tests, computerized simulations, but not the real thing. And I do think there comes a point at which you might actually feel the need, if you're going to be confident that these things are fit for purpose on the day, that you may need to do some actual tests to for reassurance purposes. But one would hope that um, this would only be done when the case is incontrovertible, for there to be such a need. And as minimal as possible. The problem is, if one, we get the security dilemma. One country tests in order to reassure itself about the viability of its capabilities. The other countries look at this and say, well, this represents an escalation and it's something we've got to respond to.
And earlier, when you were talking about the many examples that we've seen of Russia's attempts to destabilize or interfere with foreign democracies, be it politically encroaching into sovereign airspace, sponsoring sabotage attacks, severing underwater cables, what do you see as the biggest threat right now to Europe? And how has that changed since you were at the Secret Intelligence Service?
Well, okay. I mean, again, we go back to the Cold War. The degree of cohesion in the West was by no means guaranteed. I mean, different countries had very different attitudes towards relations with the Soviet Union, different attitudes towards relations in terms of nuclear confrontation. One recalls in the United Kingdom in the 1980s. All the protests, Greenham Common, etc., etc. There was nothing really, approaching a clear national consensus, in this regard. And of course, we've got something similar now in relation to Europe. I mean, some countries, sort of very, very determined to confront Russian aggression. Other countries, Spain, saying, well, we're not going to see the Russians coming across the Pyrenees, so why should we care? The United States adopting a more unpredictable and more transactional approach towards its earlier commitments to guaranteeing European security. I don't think these have gone away. I just said, I do believe that they are, sort of being um, remodeled on, shall we say, a more transactional basis, and the expectation that at long last Europe might actually start paying for its own defence. But I think probably the biggest threat we face is in terms of um, collective political will to confront a revisionist and aggressive Russia. That I would say is probably our single biggest threat, because if we want to, we can rearm. We can afford to rearm. It is possible to do this. But in order for that to happen, political elites have to internalize and accept the challenge and the risk that Russia poses. And going back to what Donald Tusk was saying at the weekend, I don't think that has happened yet. I agree with him on that.
So, if there is no consensus, where do you see this going?
Well, like most things in life, it's going to be messy and non-linear in its progression. I suspect that the impact of Russia's behavior is probably such that we will see Europe and the West writ large holding firm, notwithstanding China's support, which is a significant factor, of course, because China's position is that it does not want to see an outcome of the Ukraine war which looks like a Russian defeat and a Western US victory. That I think is ultimately their bottom line. But I think all things being equal, think we'll probably will hold. There will be starts and stops, and not everything will go well. We won't be able to manifest continuing cohesion and determination. Things like defense budgets, governments under pressure we'll always look at ways of cutting them. What they're not doing at the moment, actually, so much, and certainly in the UK, and that I think is pleasing, is not cutting intelligence budgets, which of course is a subject dear to my heart, and that I think is important. We cannot not continue to invest in the best possible intelligence capabilities to ensure that we fully understand what the intentions of revisionist powers like Russia are, and where the vulnerabilities are, and how we can maximize our strengths.
So, what would you be advising the government now, if you were still in post at MI6, about the dangers posed by Russia and the action that should be being taken?
Well, as and I think we've covered all the threats. I think the first thing I would argue for is as a greater focus on the obvious threats that we know we're facing. Things like cognitive operations quite difficult to deal with, because it's actually not that easy to work out how effective they are, what effect they do have, or what you can do about them. But I think this is an area that does require more focused attention. It's something that we did have in during the Cold War. Now that is a skill, I think, that has atrophied to some extent.
And by that, do you mean disinformation operations?
I don't mean disinformation. During the Cold War, we did a lot of information operations. The difference between what we did and what the Soviet Union and its, the Warsaw Pact allies did, we only put out stuff that was true. The stuff we put out was stuff that the Soviet Union would prefer to have seen buried, and we went to some lengths to kind of resurrect that and put it out into the public domain. In contrast, the Soviet Union made up all sorts of quite outrageous claims. The best known of which was that the AIDS virus was produced by the United States as a biological warfare weapon, and I was using Black Africa and the developing world in which to test this virus. The West never did anything like that. So I think we need to sort of stick to that. It's much more difficult in the contested information environment we now inhabit, the so-called post-truth world. But it is something, I think, that requires more focus, concentration, and specialization.
But when you talk about cognitive operations, what do you mean exactly?
I mean things that shape shape perceptions in a target population, and in the case of an authoritarian regime such as Russia, trying to put into the public domain the real story, as opposed to the one that their in contrast to their version. And this was, I think, a key component of the outcome of the Cold War, the samizdat material that was circulated throughout the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries. The ability to promote and have accepted an alternative narrative to that put out by these authoritarian regimes. This was, I would argue, probably the key to the outcome that we eventually saw.
And how successful are we at that at the moment inside Russia?
Well, I mean, the Russian state would say that we're terribly successful. I mean, people talk about the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, referring to an article written some time ago in an obscure journal by General Gerasimov, commander of the Russian military, where Gerasimov was saying, look, the West is, sort of inundating us with, destabilizing information. Organizations such as yours, the BBC, Voice of America, etc. They're flooding our airwaves and inundating our population with all this stuff about liberal democracy, gay rights, and so on and so forth. And we've got to wake up and smell the coffee and start paying them back in their own coin. So from their perspective, we're already doing this and have been. Um, for pretty much since forever. Of course, what they're doing is mirror imaging and assuming that all this activity in the West is centrally directed by the state. In contrast to what we know to be the reality.
So, if they're turning the information that's getting through against us, presumably this is not making any difference with the public at the moment. I suppose you also have to have an eye on the future for the post-Putin world and what's going to happen inside Russia. How much concern should be paid to that right now?
Well, I do think it is something we have to think about because obviously Vladimir Putin is not going to live forever. He's not going to be around forever, and nobody knows. As is characteristic of autocrats, he has made no obvious plans for succession, and this is a besetting issue with authoritarian regimes. If you identify a potential successor, it's a bit like James Fraser's The Golden Bough. Once you become the priest in the temple of Diana, you know that somebody's going to come and kill you and try and replace you. So this is a kind of open question at the moment. Nobody knows, how, when, and in what circumstances Putin will go, and what his replacement might look at. I think what we should perhaps not do is allow ourselves to be deluded into thinking that Vladimir Putin's will be the head of the jolly sensible party, because that is probably the least likely outcome. We could find that Vladimir Putin is replaced by somebody even more hawkishly nationalistic and hardline than he himself, or we could find that Russia falls into a state of instability, which incidentally is China's main concern in relation to all of this. We just don't know. But the reality is that Vladimir Putin's departure is no guarantee that things will settle down into a more normal relationship.
And just finally, earlier this week, China's ambassador to the UK suggested that future UK-China relations might be harmed if it didn't recognise its claim over Taiwan.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is part of we're seeing this China now increasingly pressing internationally, states to recognize the legitimacy of its claim towards Taiwan, based on, frankly, very tendentious interpretation of history, UN resolutions, and so on. I mean, this is to be expected. It doesn't mean that that they don't. They probably do mean it. But it remains to be seen. What action China might actually take. I suspect in this regard, their bark might prove to be worse than their bite. But I think it is indicative of the growing pressure that China is seeking to bring to bear on the international community. And I think in the short term, that's not so much of a concern, but in the medium to long term, I think it is indicative of a growing impatience that potentially could be concerning. If there comes a point at which China concludes that peaceful reunification is simply not on the agenda within what they regard as an acceptable time frame, history suggests that they might be tempted to turn to more kinetic options. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, but it is a risk we have to acknowledge.
So nowhere near that, but 3.5 years into the war in Ukraine, everyone's been saying that China is watching very closely what happens there and the outcome. Is that making it more or less likely that it will take Taiwan by force one day?
I don't think that is a factor in itself. Obviously, China is looking very closely at what's happening in Ukraine and treating it as a learning experience. But the two conflicts are going to be very different. Ukraine's a land war. Taiwan will not, by definition, be a land war. It will be a maritime and an air war. My guess is that if it comes to a kinetic option, what we'll see is missile barrages trying to take out critical communication and other nodes, followed by an aerial assault aimed at taking one port. As a bridgehead from which to introduce large numbers of troops into the island. That's probably the most likely scenario in military terms, I would reckon. Forget charging up at beaches. That is for the birds. But I mean, it's still a very, very difficult calculation for Beijing to make, because what would America do in this situation? What would Japan do? What would other U.S. allies do? And in a very this is not, I think, a situation in which the Chinese Communist Party can afford to fail. A failed assault on Taiwan could actually be terminal for their hold on power, and they won't want to go there.
Nigel Inkster, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.